Hi, Vanessa. Thank you very much for joining us. I just have to say that this is a podcast for unified artists for freedom, and we're looking to hear the stories of artists who have endured, I guess, some of the restrictions over the past 3 years, and to have those stories documented and also maybe share a little bit of hope with other artists who might find themselves in a similar situation. So we're really, really grateful for you joining us today. And so thank you very much. Yeah. I should say as well that you are like multi-talented, aren't you? You're an actress, director, screenwriter.
I think I'm quite brazen in my assumption that I have anything to offer in these multiple areas. Well, I think I would describe myself as fairly intentional about getting out there and doing stuff. Yeah.
Which is great, because that's what we need to do with people who are making a difference and adding to the world rather than taking from it, I guess.
Well, I think also, as you'll know, as a creative, sometimes just having one skill set isn't really enough, because there's very rarely, certainly in the acting and film world, there's very rarely enough work to keep you going in one area. So I think particularly what actors have learnt over the last few years, I've noticed a lot of my friends who are actors are also now writing, directing, self-producing. And I think it's really exciting not to now feel we have to keep ourselves in the box of like, oh, but you're an actor, so that's all you have to offer. I think it's really good to go, well, yeah, I can do that, but I can tell stories in other ways as well. So that's been quite exciting development, I think, in the last few years. Yeah.
And I think it's also important to have independent voices telling those stories as well, which is kind of why we're doing this podcast, amongst other things. But I wanted to ask you what life was like for you, and how things were going along, and how it changed in around March 2020. So what you were doing before, and how the lockdowns affected you and your work, perhaps.
Yeah, so heads up, first of all, I'm really bad with dates. Okay. So someone goes, oh, I'm like, was that the first lockdown, the second lockdown?
Well, you can just tell the story of generally how they affected you. That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially what happened was everything shut down. I had an agent at the time who, everything changed from being able to apply for anything in any country, and it was just all about, could you do the job? And then it became, are you vaccinated, and stuff like that. And that sort of all came further down the line. But definitely when it started in lockdown, there just wasn't any work. But there wasn't any work if you were relying on other people to give you work. But actually, I was very lucky in that I already had a short film that was I'd crowdfunded through Kickstarter, and that was waiting to be shot. And so very early on in the first lockdown, I think they didn't have, I think I'm right in saying that, we didn't have the PCR testing or anything like that. So that was great, because it was like the good old days when if you felt ill, you were ill, and if you didn't feel ill, you weren't ill. Yeah. So we actually went out and shot a short film and a TV commercial during lockdown, whilst the government was still working out how much to restrict us, essentially. And so we had that freedom of like, well, we're not having to test you. Also, we had the capacity to keep a shoot running, because we weren't having to spend lots of money supporting this growing industry of sort of COVID restriction support, basically. So we didn't have to fund, all we had to have was like, some hand gel and some hand, wipes, and say to people, if you're ill, don't come to set. So I was lucky in that I managed to shoot a short film and a TV commercial. But then once the PCR testing came in, once the vaccinations came in, everything changed then, because everything suddenly became more expensive. And of course, I chose not to be vaccinated. So then there was a point where I thought I'm never going to work again, because everyone was asking, you were expected to put it on your active profile, which I didn't, but you were expected to put your vaccination status. But everything began to revolve around vaccination. And that was when it started to get a little bit tricky, and you have to start thinking, well, I'm either going to not do anything, or I'm just going to do stuff and find a way to make stories happen within this environment.
So was that like a way for you to, did that, and sort of I don't, inspiration is maybe the wrong word, but was that like encouraging you to make your own projects happen at that point? Or was that a path you were already on at that point?
I've always been when I first discovered crowdfunding, that's when I realized that it suddenly democratized the filmmaking process, in that you didn't have to wait for someone to give you permission to, yes, we like this story, we'll give you some money, we'll allow you to make it. It was you put the story out there, if people like it, they can come on board, it gets funded, you make it. So I've been doing that for a while. So I have that kind of spirit of, if I want to do it, I will. But I also work very hard to make sure that we have all the resources needed to make it happen. So I already had that spirit of like, well, no one's going to stop me if I want to do it. And when it became obvious to me, and I'll be honest here, when we first went into lockdown, I was using the hashtag stay home, stay safe. I trusted, to my shame, maybe isn't the word, because it didn't last very long, but I thought, I want to trust the government. It always felt a bit weird to me as a story maker. It always felt a bit like, oh, this feels a bit odd for us as a country to be locking people in their homes, but it's new. Okay, it's a new virus, right? We're told it's new. We don't know. It's just for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever it was. So I'll do it. So I was bleaching stuff. I wouldn't let people, it was all my kids who were in their 20s. I was like, everyone come back home because we're all locking down. My husband was supposed to be vulnerable. Turns out he wasn't, but so he was he was on the vulnerable list. So he was locked in a room in my house. And we were all doing the 1 meter apart thing, and and I was like, wash your hands. It's 30 seconds, 40 seconds, girls, 40 seconds, just to be safe. And then I was on Twitter all the time, as I always am. And then I began to realize that the data wasn't really stacking up. And my gut feeling about this all being, nonsense in terms of the level of restriction that we were going through, when you align it with the sort of like the impact that COVID was actually having, actual COVID, not with COVID. That was the thing that was when I realized, it was like, what's all this with COVID? You can be hit by a bus and it's still a COVID death. And then I was like, no, I'm not buying into this anymore. And then I sort of released myself from that. I can't remember why I'm talking about this. I can't remember what question I'm answering.
It's okay. It's interesting, and it's interesting. It's good to have that kind of insight, because to be honest, some people are a little bit critical of those who may have had taken different stances, but I think it's very understandable to me to give the people the benefit of the doubt, because nobody really knew what was happening, and even those people who suspected it wasn't true didn't know the extent of the truth or the lie.
Exactly, and I think that's how it works, Francis, is because the majority, or a good proportion of people do like to give people the benefit of the doubt, particularly when you're dealing with your government, because the hardest thing for people to get their head around is that potentially that the government is working against the people it governs, rather than being a little bit shambolic, making a few mistakes, but generally, they've got our best interests at heart. And the power of, the game of cognitive dissonance is that no one actually wants to believe the truth. So we will do everything we can. A lot of people do everything they can to not accept what is staring them in the face, biting them on the nose, slapping them around the cheeks. It's perfectly obvious, but it's so painful, excuse me, it's so painful and it's so overwhelming, and it makes you feel so disempowered that you'd rather just carry on with the lie. But I inherited my dad's cynical, he was like, oh, the government's out to get us. My mother was always like, Pete, please. So I have a mixture of both. But I have my dad to thank for the fact that actually his cynicism probably turned out to be screaming realism. And, you know, I think once you allow yourself to look at the logic of everything in front of you, whether you want to believe it or not, just look at the logic of it. Can the government really be this incompetent? No. And then as a storyteller, I began to see how there was this great feature film being written, how every act was expertly crafted. I mean, the psyops was incredible, very, very impressive, but also slightly disappointing that so many people have fallen for it. But then I began to see as a storyteller, this is exactly what I would write if I wanted people to do this, because as a storyteller, as an actor, you're sort of in the business of manipulating people into a position where they respond to your story in the way you want them to. You want to take them on a journey. And although they're going into that story with free will and free choice, and they stay in the story completely freely, you can turn the telly off, you can leave the auditorium, you know, whatever. You're not trapping people into it, but you are steering them along the paths that you want them to go through to get them to that experience that you want to share with them at the end. And that's a benign scenario, because we want the best for our audience. We want them to share the journey with us. But to me, it seemed entirely that's what the government was doing. And I think, luckily, partly because I've read a lot of scripts, and so I know a script when I see one, and I was seeing a script. Pure and simple, I was seeing a script.
I think that's a really fascinating insight, and it's something that with previous what people suspect as being psychological operations, maybe, and even this one, so maybe you can forgive people for not having a scientific understanding and a scientific grounding. Yes. And you can forgive people for, I mean, you can forgive people for everything, really, obviously, but
yes,
but you can understand, you maybe don't have maybe a historical understanding, maybe you've never looked at history, but then it starts to become like, well, maybe you've never read a novel, or you've never played chess because of an awareness of consequence. Or I mean, not everyone has to play chess either, but then it becomes down to that very thing, like, it's almost like the sequential maneuvering that the government was making, which we're describing as a script or a narrative. At some point you're thinking, well, have you not seen any scripts before? Have you never watched the film? This is how it unfolds. But people always see themselves as being here and not see where they're going. I think they don't see the trajectory a little bit.
And that's what's been so interesting. One of the things that's been so interesting is we're always saying, well, learn from history. You know, we've learned from history. Slavery is bad. We've learned that from history. We've learned this from history. But then we find ourselves you're like, yes, but at every point in history, people have learned something from history, and yet we still had concentration camps. And then we move on and we still have ethnic cleansing. And yet somehow we're going, but that's now. And you know, we look through that lens of not wanting to think that we are those people that might possibly, first of all, not see it, and then when we do see it, not want to admit that we are seeing it, and then by doing that, actually becoming complicit.
Yeah. Because
I think once you've seen it, like, you can't. You have to do something with that. You choose a side. You pick a side. You know, I think some people haven't seen yet, but I think when you have seen, to then turn away from that and say, I can't look at that anymore because it's too painful, it's a dangerous choice to make, because then we lose ourselves. But it was really great being on Twitter. You know, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? It's probably like a quadruple-edged sword. But then I started discovering people like David Payton, and I hate data, as I've just, you know, like admitted, like I'm numerically dyslexic, so I cannot deal in numbers
Okay.
on any level. But for some reason, I was following a guy called David Payton, who's a lovely guy. I've met him now and consider him to be a friend, who's Cricket Wyvern on Twitter. And he was just churning out, he was just crunching data. And goodness knows why I was looking at it, because I can't really understand it. But then I was looking at it, and he was making it very obvious that stuff wasn't adding up. And then there were people like Laura Dodsworth, who later on down the line, you know, wrote that book where she'd done loads of interviews of people in all sorts of, you know, government, all sorts of sectors, and just reaffirming. I think what was nice about Twitter was it started to reaffirm people who, you know, have credentials, unlike me, who have credentials to say, actually, no, from a medical point of view, from a scientific point of view, there's this alternative viewpoint. And for me, that Twitter was really helpful in helping me to find a community of very eclectic people from all sorts of walks of life who are finding themselves able, which is what you're trying to do, you know, what you're doing with this, just being able to pull yourself together somehow so that you didn't continue in that position of isolation that I felt was quite an engineered situation for people to be in. We were encouraged to be individual, you know, to look after ourselves and our own tiny unit, not to connect. All that sort of thing was becoming very ingrained in our psychology, and I wanted to break out, which is why lockdown was so damaging on so many levels. But I wanted people to reconnect and to talk, and I could see that maybe that was being made quite difficult for us to do through censorship on social media, but also just ingraining in people that essentially people were the danger, not the virus. I think that was what was beginning to subliminally rest in people's psyche, was that they saw you as the danger, and bodily autonomy was somehow an affront to their personal safety rather than a right that we've had, you know, since time immemorial. So social media, finding other creatives is incredibly difficult, actually, because creatives have they have so much to lose by exercising freedom of speech, which is a terrible thing to say in the creative world, because creativity is all about pushing boundaries and
Freedom of expression.
Creating debate, challenging narrative. Yes, freedom of expression. So that's quite a painful thing to have to sort of come to terms with. I think some of that has changed, maybe, or maybe there's a shift. There's another sector. I don't know what it is really, but do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it may be that it's becoming necessary to create a new like sector, as you say, or just a mode of working, or connections that can work together and be able to freely express themselves.
And going back to I remember you asked me a question about half an hour ago about independent voices. I think you're absolutely right that independent voices have become far more important. If we can find ways to fund ourselves, then being able to maintain control of the story that you want to tell has become increasingly more important and more difficult, but more important.
Well, I think that's really important what you said. You said you weren't credentialed, but actually having an understanding of narrative and how to manipulate an audience is a credential, and that was your or is your strength, and it was one of the means that helped you to see through it.
Yes,
and now you, like, in terms of, you talked about being disempowered, but it's empowering you now to reshape the narrative or to contest it. We're all doing it in our own little ways, we're making posts or memes or videos, and I was having conversations with friends. We're trying to reshape the narrative to say, hang on, that narrative isn't quite, the one that I would play to or show you, or and you've done that as well, haven't you? You've made a short film you've made a number of short films, obviously, but the one that was directly about the connections that had been lost or affected by lockdown.
Yeah, so there was a short film, if you're talking about Bus Stop, there was a short film that I made actually before lockdown, because human connection has always been something that's fascinated me, like just how humans relate to each other. So I made, well, you might be talking about small talk. I'm not, but previously to
Tell us about
lockdown,
Oliver.
I made a film called Bus Stop, a short film, which is up on YouTube, which happens to be about the power of human connection, unexpected connection. And I started sharing that. It finished its festival run, and so it was able to go on YouTube. And I started sharing that again during lockdown, and because I was like, hey, this is what we're meant to be doing, and people were watching it, and people were actually touched by it, and were sort of like revisiting, you know, the fact that once upon a time we had permission to just sit at a bus stop and just like explore unexpected connection. And then I made one, the one that we made, shot in lockdown, was actually planned before lockdown, which is about men's inability to talk to each other in the way that women do. Like women will sit there going, ah! And you're like, everything about us, you know, about 5 minutes. But men, and this was particularly thinking about mental health and supporting each other. So we shot that during lockdown, which was a really surreal experience, because we had to do that with, at that point, that's I think the only time I've worn a mask on set, because I was wearing it so that other people would be happy, because people were scared, you know. So I thought the only way we're going to get this film made is if we just do the masks, we try and do the social distancing. So we had about, you know, such a small crew, no hair and makeup, 2 actors who luckily exceptional actors, and luckily the setup was, they didn't, you know, it wasn't a romance, so there was no like, how are we going to get around the snogging? We just wanted to so it was just eating some sweets, which we also had to cheat, because, you know, you can't hold a packet of sweets and then take one and then eat one, so all of that. But that was a very surreal experience, making a short film about the importance of staying connected in a lockdown where we were being told staying connected may kill you. So it was a really, and the film is now in post-production. We're sort of at the final end of post-production, and I'm really happy with it, and I'm really happy with it, and I'm also very excited to be able to get it out there and share that whole story about the kind of like just that parallel universe of living in the story of these 2 men, whilst also trying to work around this narrative that actually human connection is potentially damaging to your health in a way that we've never seen before with any viruses ever.
So that film's called Small Talk, and it'll be coming out soon, right?
That's called Small Talk.
And that one is,
yeah.
and people can find that because you're available on Instagram and Facebook under your name, Vanessa Bailey. So if they want to find that, that'll come out in the near
so
future.
that will go into so I've got one that's The Long Walk Home, which is again about family and human connection and all that sort of thing. That's on YouTube now at the moment. So that's just finished its festival run. So Bus Stop and The Long Walk Home are on the 9 Yards Films YouTube channel, which is my production company. Small Talk is in post-production, and then it will go, I'll submit it to film festivals. So it will have to do that first, and then it will go online. So it hopefully will be around in film festivals at some point.
Yeah, so I've seen The Long Walk Home, and also Bus Stop, and I think I recommend people watching. They're short films, about sort of 9-10 minutes or so, and very powerful. If people want to take a look at them, it's an important thing to explore as well, because in the context of lockdown, you couldn't sit on the same park bench as somebody else. They had everything was taped over, and people we saw, probably maybe not in this country so much, but I don't know, because I don't go in many buildings with those lifts. But I've seen pictures of people where they had to face the wall of the lift, and so they were eliminating all those small encounters that we have, where you might find yourself in a friendship or relationship with somebody you didn't expect to even associate with. Yeah,
and I'm a big believer in talking to, like, connecting with random people on the street, because I think, you know, it's very British of us. I have my children, like, I consider myself to be a friendly person, but my children say I have a resting bitch face. It's basically, and it doesn't mean I'm like thinking of stuff. And but I do like to crack out a smile when I'm on the street. And because I didn't wear a mask, I wore it for that shoot, and then after that I didn't wear it in the supermarket. I just, I had my lanyard from Amazon. It said I was exempt. And then after that, I got rid of that as well, because I thought, well, I am exempt whether I've got a lanyard or not. But I would make it, my husband and I would make it our mission to sort of go out, walking around, smiling at people, even if, mask or not. And a lot of people, I could see that they were trapped in this, either I've got to do the right thing, or people will feel badly about me, and I don't want to kill people, or they were genuinely afraid. But people were starved of that warmth of like sudden spontaneous facial recognition of your worth as a human being, and I wanted to continue to share that. So I would make a point of talking to people and smiling at people on the tube, in the queue, and if they were scared of me, that was fine. But a lot of people actually would then, down it would come, and they'd have a little chat, or I'd be like, it's okay, I've got coffee. I'm now not going to kill you.
Wow.
I would do that. I would get onto the tube, and if people were, I would always like to have coffee with me, and I'd just do that, and then I'd smile. I'd do that, and then I'd risk a word, and people would talk. People in masks would smile with their eyes and talk to me, and I felt that was a really powerful thing that I could do, was just to go out and just maybe for a few seconds eliminate that fear, just even if it's just seconds within their existence where they forget to be afraid, and just have someone who's not scared of them, reaching out to them and offering them that opportunity to be human again, in the fullest possible way.
So that's kind of empowering as well. And so you've got your vehicles for artistic expression, the short films, and what you're doing is empowering. So I'm thinking in terms of creative people watching this, or any people watching this, but also any people can sit and smile and talk to their neighbor and just almost erode those barriers that have been erected between us.
I think for creatives who have got the same kind of like looking through the same lens as you and I, we can look back on this time and think, this is such a learning curve for us as creatives. And there's so much here that we can bring into our stories that will, I hope, we can see the mask thing building back up again now, can't we, already? It's like being talked about as if it's going to happen. But I think they'll have kickback this time. But I think we can take what we've learned as creatives and we can bring that into our stories now, and our way of being, and our kind of like general energy. And we have that gift of being able to say, never again, not on my watch, over my dead body. And I mean that literally. Never again will I allow human beings to be treated like pariahs in society. Never again will I stand by and watch the government persuade people to deal with each other in a way that's actually should be so what's the word? It should fill us with abhorrence when we're told to behave towards people as if they are less than us. And that's what was happening. You are less than me because, and as creators, we must never do that, because we talk about inclusion all the time, but inclusion is only inclusion if it's inclusion. Free speech is only free speech if it's everyone. Inclusion is only inclusion if it's everyone, regardless of their beliefs, their, medical status, whatever. We have to remember that as creatives, and maybe we can find ways of bringing that into very intentionally bringing that into our art moving forwards, so that we're able to be another voice that's saying to people, but wait, we're beauty, there's beauty, there's freedom, there's autonomy, there's richness of human connection, and there are all these beautiful things, and they exist, and we're here to amplify them and to remind you to embrace them and be part of them. So I hope that's what we can do as creatives.
Yeah,
so that we're not seeing all of it as totally negative, but actually allowing it to empower us in a way that it doesn't want to do, but it does empower you. I think it does. Once you resolve, then that's power, isn't it? Once you say, no, I'm going to stay free, then that's power. And they can't take that away. No one can take that power of free choice away from you. They really can't. Courage is an incredibly difficult thing to destroy.
And also, I think courage is something that, like grows like a muscle or a practice. The more you use it, the more courageous you become.
Yeah. It's the opposite of I remember watching a Jordan Peterson podcast or something, and he was saying, so I think what you're saying is courage works in the opposite to how we are conditioned to comply. Is basically, it's like a domestic abuse, it's like a abusive relationship situation, isn't it? You have a boundary, and the abuser will push that boundary, and they'll push it until they pushed it too far, and you find the courage to resist, and then they stop. But they've pushed your boundary from there to there, okay? Then they stop. Then they come back and they push it a bit more and a bit more until you say, no, no more. But they pushed it from there to there. And then they come back and they push it again. And they keep doing that until you don't even resist anymore. And that's how, sorry about the light. I need a DP or it all goes to and I think courage works the opposite way. I'm afraid of that. I'm going to do it. Oh, I did it. I'm afraid of that now, but I'm going to reach out and I'm going to confront that. And that we're used to as creatives, right? We're used to working outside of our comfort zone because that's where we make our best work. When we've pushed ourselves to a place where we don't think we can, where our feet are off the ground, we're treading water, we feel unsafe, but we do it anyway, and it works, and we find a story and we go, great, now I'll push myself a bit further. So as creators, we should be used to that. And I think you're right, courage is a muscle and it works the same way. The more you exercise it, the more courageous you get. That's a really good point. I haven't thought about that.
I wanted to just say, I mean, we've got about 5 minutes left, but I was just, I wanted to ask you, because you've been very outspoken and you've also mentioned the threat that was hanging over you, that you may never work again. Now, how did you, I mean, obviously we just talked about courage there, but you obviously had to take a risk there to be outspoken, and what enabled you to take that risk, and maybe in a way that maybe some of your peers have not been able to in the business?
Well, I'm lucky in that I'm married to someone else who has a salary.
Okay.
So a lot of creatives aren't in that position. I lost an agent that I'd had for 11 years.
Okay.
I haven't worked that much. So that, I've worked a lot less than I would normally be working. But financially, obviously, I have someone else who looks after me financially. And so that there's not that worry. And it's really difficult for people. You have to have money to work. But because I was in that situation, I thought I have to use my voice then.
Yeah. So do you know people who have not been able to speak out, who want to?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. From very high up to,
wow,
for just starting out, or people, like me who have been doing it a long time, but like no one recognizes you, so that's fine. But yes, I mean, I know actors, very high level actors, who just believe exactly the same thing, or filmmakers, creatives, but they can't say anything because I know people who've got fake COVID vaccine passports, because I currently can't go into America. I can't watch my films so one of my films was recently at Newport Beach Film Festival, which is an incredible film festival. And I'd said with this one, if it gets into this one, because it's the third one that's been in, that if it gets into this one, I'm going over. I've never been to America. I'm going to go over and go to the festival. I can't find any light. Go to the festival and watch it, and I couldn't because I was going to go there and kill everyone because I'm not vaccinated. So that, but things like that, you know, you put a lot of work in, and then you don't get the benefits that you would hope to have got. So, but I know there are lots of creatives who find it really difficult or impossible to speak out, and I totally understand that. I have every sympathy, but I also do think that if you can find it in your heart, the more of us there are who can come together and say, let's stick together with each other, and let's look after each other as much as we can. And the more, you know, the more we do it, the stronger we'll get, and the more supported we'll feel. And I think, I don't want to push people into doing stuff that's going to destroy them economically. That's not fair at all. And emotional blackmail is never fair. So it's all about looking at your own personal position. But because I was able to weather the storm financially, I had nothing else to lose. So I'm like, right, well, I'm gonna do it then and see what happens.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what the purpose of this podcast is. It's obviously unified artists for freedom, and I think the more of us there are, the more we create a system that doesn't, you know, engage with this kind of exclusion that we talked about. The more powerful we'll be, and the more able we'll be able to express ourselves freely and build something better, and have that impulse that you talked about before to work away from what we don't want. So yeah, I think this is all really important, and unfortunately we're out of time. But I'm really, really grateful.
No, I talk. I'm terrible.
No, it's brilliant. That's what you want, and that's what you want on a podcast. Surely, people to talk. So, yeah, and also it's good to be able to talk so freely, given that we have been silenced in various ways over the past few years.
Yeah, and can I just say one final thing? I would just always say all of this to be done not in the spirit of judgment ever, but just in the spirit of bringing people on board. Never to judge people's choices, because it's really hard for people. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. And I'm aware we might get cut off at any minute, so I'll just say thank you. And Vanessa Bailey, thank you for joining us. That's been great.
Thank you.
Real pleasure. Bye-bye.